Good evening, hello and welcome, all of you. On the behalf of Usanas Foundation, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to all our eminent panelists today and our participants and those who have joined from the various parts of the world. Today, we are going to discuss a very critical question, finding a roadmap for the peace in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war and the quest for the global stability regime. As we see that today, I think it's the 47th day of the Russia-Ukraine war, and we can see immense destruction of human life, infrastructure, humanitarian catastrophe, and a lot of looming fears for the future. But I will begin today's discussion by two important questions. First question takes us back in time, which is not as important as my next question, which is about the future. My first question is, was this war avoidable? As we can see, many of the prominent Western experts like George Kennan and the famous IR experts like John Mearsheimer repeatedly told time and again that there are certain red lines which need not be crossed in the Europe. And diplomacy could have been the best solution to work out solutions. But I guess after the Cold War ended in the year 1990, certain things were not clearly understood, and some kind of expansion, NATO's expansion, took in a very explicit manner in the Europe, and today things have come to this pass. Over the last 2.5 decades, there were many occasions when we, as a member of the current global order, decided to dump diplomacy to the dustbin. And the result we saw in the form of Libya, Iraq, and the current ongoing catastrophe. Even now, we are not realizing the value of diplomacy. And my second question is how to find the roadmap for the peace, how to end this war, how to find a solution, how to de-escalate. That is my second question. And with this, also the question arises, is our current attitude helping to resolve the situation or not? Unilateral sanctioning, besides that, very massive and vicious information warfare, information and propaganda war from both the sides, certainly is not helping to resolve this problem and this catastrophe. But this is high time that we needed to put all our resources to find a diplomatic solution. In this context, India has taken a stand which can best be summarized by two phrases which I'll borrow from Shri Bhagavad Gita, and they are Sthit Pragya and Nirasakt. By Sthit Pragya, we mean we don't get affected by external influences and undue pressures. And by Nirasakt, I mean that we are dispassionate and detached, not a passive observer, but a detached and dispassionate observer working in the enlightened self-interest as well as for the world peace in this conflict. And we need entities like that who can talk to both the parties. Thirdly, the last part of this segment is that how to find solutions to avoid such conflicts in the future. As we saw before the Second World War, League of Nations failed. Even today, we saw that the most of the multilateral arrangements which we made or which we announced with a lot of zeal and passion are not doing a great job, in fact. And in fact, most of the multilateral institutions continue to be driven by one particular set of agenda, and they continue to be unrepresentative. So, in order to find global stability, I must say, peace is a very far-fetched dream. At least we can look for the global stability in this world, which is increasingly moving towards multipolarity. And to make sure that this multipolar world is not anarchic and chaotic, we do need to find that global stability regime. Today, we have an array of experts that includes military generals, diplomats, and academicians to work out this roadmap for peace. Besides that, this is also going to be a real-time exposure to the young IR scholars on how the diplomatic parleys happen in a real-time setting for solving and resolving the international conflicts. And hopefully, after this session, I believe that we'll come out with some really great insights which will provide some relevant policy guidelines to the governments and to other stakeholders and actors interested in resolving this conflict. Thank you very much. From now on, I'll hand it over to our today's chair, Ambassador Anil Trigunayat, who is also the member of Usanas Advisory Board and has been a great support and definitely a great mentor, friend and philosopher to Usanas Foundation. Thank you very much for joining. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Abhinav, for you have already laid out the contours of our discussion today. It's always a great pleasure to be on the Usanas Foundation's discussion forum. You have really been doing an amazing job in the last 2 years or so. Today, it is a great honor and a privilege for me to be part of and moderate this session, where we have probably one of the most highly distinguished speakers, thinkers, and trendsetters, whether they are diplomats or academicians, or for that matter, journalists. So I think that this is going to be an enriching session on a very, very difficult subject. You have said that we should achieve peace and there should be no possibility of a war. The world has been hankering for this ideal scenario for a very long time. But it looks like that the war is intrinsic to the nature of human being. And every time, whenever we have sort of a geopolitics, for whatever reason, whether it is for geo-economical reason or geo-strategic reasons, we always see the war as the most likely the first recourse, not even the second. So if you have power, you want to exercise it. I mean, that is something that is an unfortunate reality in today's world. Today, as we discuss this issue, we are already into 49th day of the war, and destruction in Ukraine has led to the very worrying scenario and the situation. This has been a result of long-standing Cold War mindset, geopolitical and geoeconomic contestation. The outcome of this would be even worse, in my view. World is getting divided between hardcore Cold War 2.0 with a hot fuse at all times, where we could witness an alternate financial architecture, or several of them, including basic and fundamental good old barter mechanisms and the national currency trading, which will change or will have an impact on this already very stressed transitional global order in ways which is very difficult to fathom. China, of course, figures in every calculation. And as a result of the most severe sanction ever applied on any country, Russia may be decimated to some extent. But a new matrix would be more dangerous and destabilizing, for which, in my view, Western countries cannot be absolved of all responsibility. They have been part of it. And as you mentioned, was the war avoidable? Indeed it was. But situations were created. So we know that this is how. Regime change again has become very fashionable. Tool for the superpowers. Iraq to Libya to Yemen to Syria and now Ukraine. And even Russia for that matter, where we have seen the death and destruction and horrendous situations where millions were killed and the millions have become refugees all over. Today we are talking of the European refugees, but at the same time, the refugees in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere, we see them there. Nobody bothers about them anymore. But this war has actually also exposed the frailty of the international world order, or whatever is left of it. The fault lines of the systems are very clear. The countries consider the United Nations or the multilateral institutions as an instrument of their foreign policy. And therefore, they are invested only to that extent in those, not beyond, not more, not less. And on this war, we have seen millions of articles also have been written, and every day there is a discussion going on where what is right, what is wrong, whether it could have been or not. And what is at stake today, apart from the peace? At the stake is the so-called international order. We are seeing the humanitarian catastrophe. We have condemned it also. But as we know, to begin with, Russia's objectives after it was spurned by the West, especially the United States, and let's not make no mistakes. In my view, this war is not between Russia and Ukraine. This war is between Russia and the United States at all levels. And that's where it is being played out. So Russia's basic objectives to begin with, as President Putin said, for demilitarization of Ukraine and denazification. And to those points, I'll request the concerned speakers to delineate a little bit more. But more importantly, yesterday, Foreign Minister Lavrov said that the Ukraine war was meant to stop US global domination. And this domination is built on gross violations of international law. So when that is the situation, then this is an additionality that has been added to the already very complex situation. But we have to also see now that this is a very different kind of a war. Most of us depend, the whole world is rather dependent on the media. That is playing another kind of a war, which is disinformation warfare, the psyops, and these are being played out on day in, day out. And with this kind of social media and 24/7 TV channels, the kind of narratives, war of narratives is being played out. And therefore, it is extremely difficult to have a dispassionate view of the ground situation. As far as India is concerned, I know my friend Ambassador Vishnu Prakash will be speaking a great deal on this, but I would like to just say that India has stood throughout this, whether you call it neutrality, you call it abstaining vote, but it has stood with sanity. That is the only thing I would say as far as India, a principled approach. And this has been reiterated yesterday by Prime Minister Modi in his discussions and summit with President Biden, where he took the bull by the horn. Everybody was wondering whether Ukraine will be discussed. But Prime Minister Modi very clearly conveyed India's position, irrespective of whatever the world looks at or is going to do next. So today, actually, we have a great panel, and I was wondering how to approach our distinguished speakers. So I thought I'll go from left to right or a clockwise manner. But as Ambassador Carmen has said that he'd like to speak a little later, so I'm requesting now Dr. Andrey Kortunov, my friend, the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council, and he has previously served as Deputy Director of the Institute for US and Canadian Studies. He was the founder and first president of the Moscow Public Service Foundation. His academic focus is international relations, the foreign and domestic policy of Russia, and Russian-American relations. Dr. Kortunov is the author of over 120 publications dedicated to the analysis of Soviet-Russian-American relations, global security, and the foreign and domestic policy of the USSR and Russia. Dr. Kortunov, what is Russia's game plan, and how do you see it evolving henceforth? The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Your Excellency. First of all, let me say that I am privileged and I'm honored to be a part of this very timely and a very important conversation. I'm glad to see some of my old friends from India and other places here, though in an online format. But let me, first of all, very briefly approach the questions that you have just raised, and then speculate a little bit on the implications of the conflict for the international system at large. First of all, the question was raised about whether this war was inevitable or not. My personal take is that every conflict, every military conflict is a failure of diplomacy. And that implies that we should have made some blunders in Moscow, in Kiev, in Western capitals. We didn't use the time that we had after the first crisis in relations between Russia and Ukraine back in 2014. We failed to insist on the implementation of Minsk agreements, which provided for certain opportunities to resolve the problems in a peaceful way. I think nobody really wanted to see de-escalation, and that led to the situation that we face right now. As for the resolution of the conflict, I think that it is still possible, provided that everybody involved in the conflict is able to demonstrate a degree of flexibility. And I would be happy to share with you some of my views on what specifically should be done in order to de-escalate the conflict, in order to bring, if not an ultimate agreement, at least a stable ceasefire. If there is interest, we can go into these details. But let me try to use the time that I have to address a more general issue, and the issue of implications and repercussions of this conflict for the international system. I think that there are two very different, fundamentally different views on what specific repercussions the conflict might have on the international system that exists today in the world. The first view, I would call it a more or less optimistic view. It implies that the conflict in Ukraine is a kind of aberration, a deplorable exception from the established rules of the game, a kind of random blip on our radar screen. And the second view is more pessimistic, which suggests that this conflict is just a graphic manifestation of things to come on a much larger scale in the nearest future. So the question is whether the world is going to get back to business as usual after the conflict is over, or rather, is the international system has passed the point of no return and our lives will never be the same. Let me remind you that the same question was frequently asked at the initial stage of the COVID-19 pandemic. Some people argued that it was a game changer, that after the COVID pandemic, life would never be the same, that we are entering uncharted waters, and that the global order is going to collapse due to the pandemic, or at least it will be reformatted in a very significant way. And the opposite view was that the pandemic did not really change the rules of the game, that the pandemic only accelerated some of the trends that were already there, and that's why we cannot really call it a turning point in the contemporary international system development. So the same can be said about the current crisis in Ukraine. And I think that we can discuss all possible dimensions of the international system which might or might not be affected by the current crisis. For instance, if you take the global economic and trade system, optimists would say that, of course, there'll be some implications. For some time, energy prices are likely to go up. The world will experience a deficit of food, so food prices are likely to go up. Maybe we will see some disturbances in the global financial system, but the global international system at large is resilient enough to absorb the shocks produced by the war in Ukraine. So the American dollar as the major reserve currency is strong enough to maintain its prime position in global finance, and the energy market is flexible enough to adjust to the Western sanctions against Russia. There will be some redistribution of oil flows and gas flows, but it would not really be a revolution. The green agenda will go on, maybe slowly than we anticipated it just a year ago, but the green agenda will be with us. So everything will be just nice. The opposite viewpoint is that the dollar will lose its position of the major reserve currency much faster than we thought it would. We will see the death of the green agenda. It will be put on a back burner, and the climate change will be accelerated due to that. And we might see also unexpected economic consequences of this war, including the world probably sliding into another recession before too long. The same can be applied to the domain of international security. Optimists, of course, recognize that the crisis will negatively affect problems of arms control, non-proliferation, fight against international terrorism, and so on. However, they stay hopeful that the international security system will not only survive, but might even get even stronger after the crisis. Pessimists on their side believe that what we see right now is the end of arms control, at least the arms control that we used to know, that the crisis in Ukraine will be followed by a chain of other regional crises, including possible crisis in the Taiwan Strait, maybe some state crisis in Africa and in the MENA region. We will see more proliferation, and we will see more international terrorism. Likewise, there is no consensus on how this crisis is going to affect international organizations. Again, there are optimists who believe that the UN system is going to survive and maybe even to get stronger. But pessimists argue that international institutions are likely to suffer. Some of them will become irrelevant. Some of them will break down. Maybe we will see regionalism replace some universalism in the international system. So there are various views, and I tried to summarize these views and to offer you three possible scenarios of how the international system might evolve after the Ukraine crisis. And I'll be very short. I promise that I will not take more than 3 minutes so that we will have some time to discuss it. I think that if we were to summarize the existing theories and concepts about how the international system might evolve after the Ukraine crisis, there are three plausible scenarios. The first one I would call restoration, the second reformation, and finally revolution. Restoration implies that the West will get out of this crisis much more consolidated, and probably more consolidated than ever before since the end of the Cold War. Moreover, the West will be in a position to somehow engage most of the rest to share its positions on the Ukrainian crisis. So the US leadership will be back in place, and it will survive the Biden administration. It will continue at least for another couple of years, if not decades. Russia will get completely isolated and will become a larger North Korea. China will reluctantly play by the rules set in Washington, D.C. India, of course, will get much closer to the United States. And so the world will get out of this crisis in a new consolidated form. Primarily, we will see a revised, modified version of the unipolar world of the beginning of this century. The second scenario is what I call reformation, which means that the crisis will trigger the adjustments within the system which are badly needed, but have been postponed or even sabotaged earlier by the United States or by Western political elites in general. That implies that the crisis will trigger serious reforms within international financial institutions like EBRD and IMF. Emerging economists will have more say in deciding on most important economic and financial issues. The European Union will get more military capacity and more strategic autonomy from the United States. Washington will have to cut important compromises in dealing with Beijing. China will probably reaffirm its control over Taiwan, and more resources will be transferred from the global north to the global south. Russia will stay semi-isolated for some time, but it will be gradually forgiven and will return to the most of international organizations and regime. And finally, the revolution scenario implies that we are likely to see a much more radical transformation of the international system, which means almost a complete disintegration of the existing global order, including its economic, security, and political dimensions. The world will become more fragmented and even atomized. Universal institutions and multilateral regimes will face long-term decay. Regional crises will multiply. A fierce competition between the West and the East will bring the world to a new Cold War. A revolution will ultimately end up with a new global order, but this new world order will not emerge anytime soon. So these are three scenarios which I thought of, and I think that it's important to consider any of them, all of them, because depending on what scenario will have the upper hand, we might see a very different world order within the next couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kortunov, for a fabulous presentation and very objective assessment of likely scenarios. But when we come next, I would still request you to dwell upon what is actually the Russian endgame. So I'd like you to dwell on that a little bit. Now I would like to invite my friend Ambassador Vishnu Prakash to talk about India's stance, because we are also going to talk about various efforts and the countries that are working on bringing about some kind of a resort back to diplomacy and bring about the two countries and cessation of hostilities and all. Ambassador Prakash is a very well-known figure and has been one of the finest Indian ambassadors. He was our ambassador to Canada and South Korea. He was also the official spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, External Affairs, and Consul General of India to Shanghai. He has also been posted in Moscow, New York, Vladivostok, Tokyo, Islamabad, and Cairo, and has an amazing experience across the world. Currently, he is commenting almost daily on various India's news channels and is a favorite person for them. He is a well-known analyst, an advisor, and a columnist. Floor is yours, Ambassador.
Ambassador Anil Trigunayat, thank you very much. I have a small complaint to make. You did not disclose that I have a direct line to the Kremlin and the White House besides 7 RCR. So I think this is something that you should need to add to my resume. Because, I am one of those who knows everything. So greetings and a pleasure to be with you all. Anil, you are absolutely right when you say that what we are witnessing is a Cold War mindset. This conflict should never have happened. And I think when history is written dispassionately, there'll be serious soul searching involved as to why the world has come to such a pass. I'm not going to get into the background about the eastward expansion, about of NATO, about the security concerns of Russia. But let me just say that regardless of the provocation, and yes, Russia was provoked, invasion is not the solution. And in this time and age, to invade a country, whether you call it a military operation or whatever you call it, is an absolute no-no, and there is no way to condone it. I, for one, started my career in Moscow. I have the greatest of affection for Russia. Uh, I am the first consul general in the world to set foot in Vladivostok. Have had a lot of appreciation for Russian concerns, but I must say that I have been quite disappointed at the use of force and what has happened. India is not neutral. It is absolutely wrong to say India is neutral for the simple reason India has a lot of skin in the game. Uh, we have a historical relationship with Russia. Russia has stood by us in testing times. And even after the misadventure of China across the LAC in May 2020, uh, our defense minister had gone to Moscow in June 2020. And despite the Chinese pressure, what we needed in terms of ammunition and arms, etc., was rushed to us by Russia. We are told that it is not in India's interest to have a defense relationship with Russia. Well, thank you very much. We are naive. We are a very small country. We don't know what's good for us. So please tell us how we should conduct ourselves. We are very grateful. Uh, I think it is this kind of a patronizing tone, which is when employed against a country of 1.4 billion people, which prides itself in taking independent decisions like anybody else does, is counterproductive. It affects the relationship. It shakes the confidence. Yesterday, I was at a discussion where a very senior American academic said, US expects India to do this. I couldn't believe myself. I mean, can we expect US not to have relationship with Pakistan because Pakistan-based terror groups are affecting India, are attacking India? So can we ask Uncle Sam not to do that? Or that China has been an adversary to downsize relations with China? The long and short is that every country will do what is in this country's national interest. For us, our relations with Russia are important, will remain important. We are told that Russia will become a junior partner of China. All right, maybe. Maybe it'll become, because if you push Russia against a corner, it will lean more on China. But what should we do? Should we snap relations with Russia and let our security be jeopardized? Or we still maintain relationship with Russia, which is which is a 60-year-old tradition. There is another worthy that I met virtually the other day who said, purchase of oil from Russia for Europe is a legacy, matter of legacy. But what about India's legacy with Russia? No, that is incorrect. So what I'm trying to say is that it is disappointing that various standards are being used by for various countries by various countries, but we are realistic enough to understand that that is what realpolitik is all about. That you try to have everybody fall in line, and you are told that you should be on the right side of history because the history is being written by somebody else, and so when history is written by a certain country or a certain power or a certain group of countries, you can only go wrong. Now, I am one of those who is a very strong advocate of the closest of India-US relations. And the reason why I say that is that in every sphere of activity, it is in India's interest to see the relationship grow. It has become the strongest relationship we have, but it has to be a relationship where we have our elbow space, we have our breathing space. We are not going to sign on the dotted line. And we know enough English to understand how to use the Queen's language. Now, with this background, let me come to the stand that India has taken. India cannot condone aggression. At the same time, India does not believe in calling names. When you say Mr. Putin is a killer, he's a butcher, he's a war criminal, do you think you can do business with him? You have been imposing sanctions on the world. Even North Korea, what has happened? Sure, the sanctions are going to hurt Russia badly, but McDonald pulls out of Russia. I'm sure Moscow and Kremlin must be trembling, their knees must be knocking because McDonald has pulled out of Moscow. Russians' history has to be seen to understand that Russians are nationalistic, very proud of their country, and they can handle a lot of pain. But having said that, the question now is, as we see it, is that Russia engaged in something, they overdid it. Why they overdid it? I think they miscalculated badly. The opposition from Ukraine, the combined punch of the West, and I must say here that the combined punch of the West is still formidable. Today, Russia, I would think, would like to bring this to a close. But the question is whether the West would allow Russia to do that, because the West, especially the US, wants to diminish Russia, and Russia is already diminished. I don't have three options. From my limited understanding, I think Russia is diminished. It will take a long time for Russia to recover. Ukraine has been decimated. I have mixed feelings about the stand that President Zelensky has taken. Very brave, but whether it is bravado that he has let his country to be destroyed the way it has been destroyed. And on strategic terms, the country that has achieved the strategic objectives is the US. The confidence in transatlantic alliance has been restored. US primacy has been restored. So that is how I look at the global scenario. But coming back to India, India has been unequivocal in saying that the human rights of the Ukrainians should be respected, territorial integrity should be respected, sovereignty should be respected. What does it mean? In what way are we supporting Russia? What we have said is, please cease hostility and come to the negotiating table. I do not know of any other way to resolve the problem. Abhinav asked whether diplomacy has failed. Diplomacy has failed because many nations or nations generally pay lip service to diplomacy, but believe that what has happened in the past is because of wrong policies and are condemned to repeat history again and again. We resort to conflict again and again, expecting different results, and then the law of unintended consequences take over. We have also unequivocally condemned the Bucha massacre. Now, what we have said is that there should be an independent investigation. Why? Because nobody has seen how it has happened. There is the fog of war. There is the information warfare. There are two narratives. There is a Russian narrative and the Western narrative. I'm not taking sides. But all I'm saying is that even if you see a man murdering another in daylight, do you hang the man? You go through the due process. Now, is the due process should be followed or not followed is something I leave it to the August House. From our point of view, and this is what Prime Minister had urged President Putin to do, to have a direct communication with Zelensky. I would hope that there is a ceasefire announced by Russia that they withdraw the forces. This is to me, the only realistic way to bring an end to this bloodshed. Sanctions will not be revoked. There will be a price to pay. But this war or this conflict, which is completely unnecessary and is having horrific consequences, can only be put to an end by the country which started it, and that is Russia. I hope that Russia brings it to a close, and then diplomacy is given a chance, because there is no other way forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely bang on what you said. The Russian lead that is there, but at the same time, that's what I said, that the peace can only be achieved if your concerns, essential concerns, are addressed. This is unfortunately the way superpowers behave. I was reading somewhere an interesting joke, I guess, that the Americans said, or the West in that sense, that we will fight to the last Ukrainian. We fight the Russians to the last Ukrainian. No, so this is what has happened to Ukraine in the bargain. It has become a fodder in the geopolitical rivalry of the two countries. But thank you very much. Now I'd like to request Ambassador Daniel Carmen, if he can hear us and is connected, to speak. And he knows India, he knows the region, everything. And Ambassador Carmen was former ambassador of Israel to India and non-resident ambassador to Sri Lanka. He was very well known and respected in India here. He has served as the Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and head of Masha, Israel's Agency for International Development Cooperation. He also served as ambassador and deputy permanent representative at Israel's mission to the United States. Ambassador, your country is also, like India, has not condemned the Russian aggression in the beginning, has also been trying very hard to bring about some kind of rapprochement between the two. Prime Minister Bennett traveled to Moscow, has been in touch with President Zelensky and the Western countries. How do you see it going? What do these kind of efforts, are they heading somewhere? And are you really hopeful about them? Apart from the other two questions that were asked initially, if you would kindly look at these also and inform us about the outcome of the talks, even if partial. Ambassador Carmen.
You're muted, Ambassador Carmen. Daniel, you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Yes,
I'm sorry. I tried to say that I'm very happy to be here with you, and must confess that when I was approached initially, I asked myself, what role, how can I contribute to this conversation? But then I thought that I cannot say no to any request coming from India. India is a place that is very, very dear to me. I've spent a few years there. I've been in the best of times of India-Israel relations, which will and continue to become even better. And we do have, as strange as it can sound, we do have some involvement in this very complicated conflict. I do want to make a little comment about what you just said, about when our moderator just said about we will fight to the last Ukrainian. Maybe just to throw an idea to the air, maybe there is a new definition of the word boots on the ground or non-boots on the ground. This is something that we might want to look at. As I said before, we have an involvement. Israel by no means is definitely not neutral, or definitely not indifferent to what is going on in Europe, a war in Europe. Who could even imagine that in 2022 Europe would see a war that goes back to the basics of, parameters of wars that we thought were gone already. We see, all the layout of the military, which looks like something that happened maybe 70 years ago from the military perspective, something that we really felt was long ago expired, and we thought we were going ahead with other kinds of parameters and diplomacy and relations between countries, etc. But the other side of it, and I'll get to the Israeli side in a minute, the other side of it is also a question that I, as a citizen of the world, not as an ex-Israeli diplomat in India or at the United Nations, but as a citizen of the world, I'm asking, how come does this particular conflict in Europe attract so much world attention when other areas in the world are suffering wars and miseries and genocides and other kind of terrible things that are happening, and the world is not so much shaken, if at all? And that's a question that I'm not sure we have an answer to, or maybe the answer is very simplistic, but it's terrible to think about that. We're talking about the same world that in international organizations and in meetings between leaders, and when we have those big global speeches about, climate change and eradication of hunger, etc., etc., we talk big time and very highly about the needs and the challenges of the world. But when there is a war in Ethiopia, or when there is other conflicts that are happening in other parts of the world is not so shaken as it is now. Maybe it has to do with the closeness, the geographical closeness with Europe and the Europeans or the West, which we are part of, are sort of feel it nearer and closer. But that's a question I'd like to put. It again, as a citizen of the world, it bothers me, frankly, very much. Israel, as I said before, is not neutral. And if I may correct a little bit our dear moderator, we have not kept silent and not condemned the aggression. Israel's initial stand is still is a very cautious stand for various reasons. The most obvious ones are the fact that there are very good relations between Israel and Ukraine on the one hand, and between Israel and Russia on the other. There is a huge population from both, from people originating from Russia and from Ukraine in Israel. 15% of the Israeli population are people who came from ex-Soviet Union, with a large majority of those coming from Russia and from Ukraine. Russian is almost official language of the state, in the state of Israel. Anywhere you go, you see, you speak, you make business with, and 15%. It's a very substantive number of people. So we cannot disconnect from this particular fact. Another geopolitical fact is the fact that Russia is very much involved in the Middle East, in Syria, and we practically have Russia on our border. So we did have to take into consideration, our government had to take into consideration sensitivities and be not neutral, but definitely in a very cautious position, which could sound as if Israel reacts like India, but I think there is quite a lot of difference, some of which was described by my predecessor, talking about the historical relations between India and Russia. We don't have this kind of relations, but we have other aspects of relations with both Russia and Ukraine. There is another point that I'd like to make, which is something that accompanies the Israeli stand vis-a-vis conflicts in general. And as you know, our conflict in our own region is always very much up in the agenda of the international community. And this is something that we call in our language the internationalization of conflict, which means the influence that the international community, through mechanisms, through organizations, or through other means, tries to involve itself and influence the proceedings and the results and the outcome of any conflict. We have been very strong advocates when we talk about our region, very strong advocates of the need to have direct contact and negotiations between the conflicting parties. This is something which is very important for us here in our region, in the Middle East or West Asia. And I think this would be, probably would be the way to solve this particular conflict, although we cannot neither stay indifferent nor ignore the internationalization part of it, the what was called before the Cold War mindset, the fact that we are, there was a reason something started with this war, and I think that we can understand without being neutral and without being too objective. We can understand the reasons. We cannot understand the means used by the invasion, but we can understand the concern of Russia on the one hand, and the reaction by the West with non-boots or boots on the ground, however you describe it, to this very complicated and horrible conflict that we are all witnessing. Again, the Israeli perspective, first of all, was very cautious, which gave us also the asset of being asked, or our prime minister being asked to mediate, one of a few other mediators that were asked. And as you said before, very rightly so, our prime minister traveled a few times to Moscow and then continued to Berlin and to Paris. The mediation was a little more high volume a few weeks ago. I think it has gone, the volume and the enthusiasm of having this mediation has gone down, maybe also because despite declarations, I have the feeling that both sides are not really keen as we now stand to have a mediation as such. Anyway, the Israeli involvement this is my perception of it, has lowered the volume, but we are still there. And if we can be of help, of course, our prime minister will continue being of help. Talking about the condemnation, there were a couple of days or maybe more in which there was, as our press says, there was a coordinated effort by our prime minister and our foreign minister to show and raise concern about the conflict itself. Prime minister was not talking specifically about the Russian invasion. Our foreign minister very quickly went straight ahead and condemned the aggression. And as long as we heard more of human rights and the horrible scenes on the ground, I think the volume of the Israeli reaction, being definitely part of the West in general, and in this conflict more so, the tone of the rhetoric went up until today. generally speaking, more going back to more to general things, I think we have to see, and we see, and my two predecessors did raise the issue of the international community. How efficient is it? Is it something that can continue? Is it something that has to be reformed or restored or what? As someone who has quite a lot of experience, if I may say, in the international arena, in international organizations, the weakness of the international organization, which is an ongoing effect, has shown itself at its worst situation as we now stand. I don't want to go into specific debates that happen in New York here or there, but you cannot have a Security Council debate on the first or second day of the invasion and have a president of the Security Council, which is the country on which the Security Council is debating. I know that this is the procedure, and I do know a little bit about UN procedures, but still, how can this be if this is not a outcry of saying we are here, we have the international community, but it is weak as ever. And this has been a process on anything that has to do with peace and security, anything that has to do with human rights at the United Nations. It's a very weak, we don't have an alternative yet, but it's a very weak organization, and when a very weak machinery and architecture. Unfortunately, we don't have an alternative at this stage, so we have to try to live with it. But I do want to go back to the internationalization of conflict. At the end of the day, what will happen between the parties. They will have to decide together, and God knows when this will happen, what is the place where they can actually meet with being flexible, as was mentioned before, maybe with having the international notion that there is no winner, but only gains by both sides. And then we could go to the international organizations to give the stamp. But the international organizations, as we know them now, Human Rights Council, even the Security Council, which is the last of the Mohicans in the international organizations, would give the stamp to a decision that an agreement that will have to be reached by the parties themselves. I have a few more comments, but maybe I'll touch upon them later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. You're absolutely right, and for clarifying the position. Of course, one has to have a nuanced approach to this kind of situations, and you rightly said the weakness of the international institutions, especially the United Nations Security Council, and that this is inbuilt into this. In fact, from day one when it was conceived, and so it requires a lot of reforms. Our countries are working on reforming this. And you are also right that even though the other countries can be facilitators for some kind of peace and dialogue, but at the end of the day, it will also depend on the two sides. The problem is in this war, there is a third side too. And that's where we might have a little bit of a roadblock. But every war comes to an end, and that's what we will hope for, that as soon as possible. Now I'd like to request Dr. Sarah Masha Fainberg to kindly take the floor. And Dr. Sarah is a senior researcher and head of the research program at Tel Aviv University's Air and Space Power Center, a lecturer of security studies at Tel Aviv University, and a visiting professor of Israeli affairs at George Washington University's School of Foreign Service. She previously served as policy and strategic issues advisor in the Policy and Political Military Bureau of the Israeli Ministry of Defense, and as a research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv. Madam, if you could also, apart from the general tenor of discussion, touch a little bit on how this war is impacting the Middle Eastern region. The floor is yours. Please unmute yourself. Please unmute yourself. We can't hear you. No. No, not yet.
Maybe you could unmute her, Ambassador Trigunayat.
I don't have the right. I don't know. I mean, it doesn't seem like that she's. I will ask Abhinav or Akshay to do that if they can do from their end. Akshay. Could you unmute Dr. Sarah? No.
Abhinav, if you've got the control, you can unmute her.
She's probably unmute, but maybe it's something to do with.
She is now unmuted as far as the system is concerned, is unmuted now.
Can you hear us, Dr. Sarah? Oh my God, I mean, we are not able to hear you.
Ma'am, the best thing is to switch off and switch on again.
Yeah.
That's the best way to do it.
Sure.
The controls are with the speakers. You know, we cannot do it from here because we can send a request and the speaker or the panelist, they will have to.
Yes.
Yes. So I'm so sorry for this technical deficiency. First of all, I would like to thank you and especially Ambassador Trigunayat and Abhinav for having me on this very distinguished panel. So I thank the Usanas Foundation for this very timely discussion. I will talk not as a senior researcher for the Israeli Air Force's Air and Power Space Center, but as a researcher, as a private researcher, and the views that I'm going to express are my own only. I would like to first of all start with a follow-up remark. In this distinguished panel, we've framed the war between Russia and Ukraine pretty much as a war between Russia and the West. But it needs to be articulated and stated very clearly that from a Russian standpoint, it's been also framed as a war against Ukraine, against the Ukrainian political leadership, against Ukraine as a sovereign state. So as a consequence of this, the first axiom, the first basis to solve this country is for the Russian leadership to recognize Ukraine as a sovereign state and as a state that has a right to choose its own destiny. So this is the very basic element that needs to be articulated. Regarding your question, Ambassador, let me lay out some of the implications of this crisis for the MENA region. And Dr. Kortunov very explicitly adopted a panoramic view of the strategic implications of this war. And I would like to zoom in a little bit and address the effects or the spillover on the Middle East. The first problematic change from an Arab Sunni perspective and from an Israeli perspective is that the Middle East by force is going to be less predictable. Whether you like Russia's engagement in the Middle East or not, this is a fact that Russia has acted as a source of stability and as a predictable actor in many Middle Eastern crises. For example, as a unique mediator between different conflicting parties in the Middle East, and as an actor mitigating a potential hot war between Israel and Hezbollah or Israel and Iran. So having a diminished Russia or a weakened Russia in the Middle Eastern front lines might destabilize further this already complicated region. The second implication that is problematic also for the Sunni Arab states and for Israel is the dangerous alignment or coalescence between Russia, China, and Iran. So there are fears that the war in Ukraine might actually reinforce a trend that we've seen in the past decade and really crystallize this alliance in which, Russia would be maybe a weaker actor with China taking the lead. And here the major question, the $1 million question will be, quid for China in the Middle East in the decade to come? Will China be a stabilizing factor or not? The third element, and Dr. Kortunov already mentioned it, is that this crisis really emphasizes the abandonment of many US allies by the United States. Yes, there is an engagement by NATO countries and the United States, but at the end of the day, the use of economic sanctions without a credible use of force or without a credible military deterrence creates an impression of abandonment. And I think that what we're going to see is a growing strategic autonomy of the US allies across the MENA region, from Saudi Arabia, the Gulf countries, Israel, and Turkey. And I think that we're going to see an interesting move of cross-regional alliances, or the renewal of cross-regional alliances, for example, Turkey and Israel, for example, the Gulf states, Israel and the United States. And I think we're going to see contradictory alliances, a Middle East where it makes perfect sense to be an ally of enemies. I think this is a trend that is going to be reinforced. Another trend that is of concern to us is the growing danger of a linkage between the European theater and the Middle East one. You may remember in the wake of the war, we've had signs of spillover of this crisis, of the war in Ukraine, to the Middle East. We've had heightened tensions between NATO's southern flank and Russia's power projection from Syria, with a famous Russian Syrian patrolling in Syria, the reported jamming of GPS systems at the Israeli Ben Gurion airport, which were not targeting necessarily Israel, but Israel as a US ally. So there is a concern that if this crisis was to further escalate, for example, there's been reports that Russia is now sending additional military equipment towards Finland as a result of Finland's declared a desire to join NATO, it will have a spillover effect in the Middle East, and the Middle East as a secondary theater could become a hot zone. Another concern is food insecurity. And food insecurity is not necessarily only an economic concern, it's a political one. We all remember the food riots in Egypt, and we could see, an Arab Spring 2.0 triggered by a major food crisis across the Middle East. Also, there are concerns about the stability of the Syrian regime. The Syrian regime depends on Russia air defense support and on Russian military support. Should we see a diminished or weakened Russia, what will be the consequences on Syria as a sovereign or stable state? You know, what will be the consequences? As I know we have Michael Barak in the panel. I would love to hear what will be the consequences in the Syrian front lines. Another concern is the one of the arms race and the nuclear race across the Middle East. If you see a nuclear Russia preventing NATO from helping Ukraine, what will happen to nuclear Iran targeting Israel? What will be the consequences on Israel's security? And you have the Ukrainian president in mind. So I think that you're going to have a nuclear race across the Middle East, in the Gulf states, and in other countries, because there is this precedent of the abandoned Ukraine and this very heightened awareness of the strategic autonomy that each Middle Eastern actor needs to develop. Of course, you have energy instability, but it's also an opportunity for Middle Eastern actors. We can come back to this. There are also concerns regarding the directions and volume of trade in international major weapons trafficking business. You know, there are fears of weapons from the Middle East also ending up in Ukraine via smuggling. So this is also something that is of concern. And the last concern, but not the least, is the question that I will like to ask to this distinguished assembly: how will the next war look like? The Ukrainian war is a transparent war. The Ukrainian war is a war that you've seen an unprecedented mobilization of civilians and leverage of civilians by the Ukrainian leadership and the Ukrainian army. So how will that affect another war, for example, in the MENA region or in other places of the world? Will we see army of civilian cyber architects, engineers conducting cyber attacks against a third party? So there is this concern of the future phase of the war. I would like to, Ambassador Carmen just spoke beautifully about Israel's involvement, and I agree with him that Israel is a passionate observer. Israel is not neutral. Israel is just keeping a very cautious balancing act, the same way that Egypt does, or Turkey does, or the Gulf states do. They do keep this balancing act as key partners of the United States that have developed very close relations with Russia. I just would like to add a few elements to Ambassador Cameron's remarks. First of all, Israel, as other actors, will have to navigate between different scenarios. Dr. Kortunov laid out three main scenarios. We could think of 3 or 4. The first one would be a frozen conflict for a long time. And it appears that the nomination of General Dvornikov in Ukraine might be a sign of a prolonged conflict. Dvornikov is a very well-known figure by the Israeli public because he was one of the architects and commander-in-chiefs of the war in Syria, but also in Chechnya. So this is a sign potentially pointing to that direction. You could have a dual Cold War, a Cold War with Russia and with China alike. What will be the implications for Middle East actors? You could have a nuclear Armageddon, and you could have a new world, what two authors of an Atlantic Council article, Matthew Burrows and Robert Manning, called A Brave New World, a new world architecture based on a new world order. How can Israel contribute? At the moment, Israel is blocked by a political crisis and by a new wave of jihadist terrorist attacks. So Israel's maneuver is limited, but Israel is still in the game. First of all, Israel could be a guarantor in what would be more than an MOU and more than the Budapest Memorandum, but a comprehensive list of guarantees to Ukrainian security, and Israel could be one member of this ad hoc group of nations that decided to remain neutral or to keep this balancing act, like India and Turkey. Israel could play out in the religious realm. I know that there have been efforts of religious mediation. For example, there is a plan of a mediation between the Pope and Kirill in Jerusalem. So we could think of alternative channels of mediation via religious channels. We know that the chief rabbi of Russia is very close to Putin, and we know the action of the religious leadership in Ukraine, Jewish religious leadership. So I think that the religious channel could be a good one, and Israel could be active in what it knows best, which is trauma. Israel has a very, very long history of dealing with trauma. And this war is not only about geopolitics, it's about a nation that is going to take at least 10 years to deal with that trauma, with the trauma of war. And I think that Israel could play a very positive role in helping Ukraine deal with the post-conflict trauma, and at the same time maintaining very smartly and cautiously this balancing act with Russia in the Syrian front lines. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sarah, for that very articulate and comprehensive talk that you gave and various suggestions. And I fully agree with you that we like it or not, but there is going to be an alternate grouping that will emerge with China in the lead. And there are several countries. I mean, I used to talk it as a cryptarch, but then let's see how it evolves. And situation for the moment doesn't look that good for the international order, for the United Nations. And you rightly mentioned about various initiatives that can be taken and where Israel can be a major interlocutor in this game. And, you know, this is something that when you take an objective view and a holistic approach to any conflict, then only you can be a trusted interlocutor. I mean, that is something there. Otherwise, like India has done, is essentially the same. I mean, basically calling to the reason and rationale of the people. So thank you very much. And especially on focusing on the Middle East, that's a special area of my interest. So I'm very happy to hear your views on that. Now I'd like to go to the United States, where Ambassador Alper Coskun is sitting there, and he has very kindly agreed to share his thoughts with us. And he's a resident senior fellow within the Europe program of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. His research focuses on Turkish foreign policy, especially in relation to the United States and Europe. He's a retired career diplomat of 32 years with extensive experience in bilateral and multilateral settings. He was the Director General for International Security Affairs at the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs from 2016 to 19, covering NATO transatlantic relations as well as Euro-Atlantic security architecture and defense and arms control disarmament matters. Before that, he was ambassador to Baku, Azerbaijan, where he oversaw one of Turkey's most active and largest diplomatic missions with a wide multi-agency composition. Ambassador Turkey is, of course, a NATO member and has very good relations with Russia and Ukraine, and doing rather well in bringing about the two sides to the table. Your country has become a host of several meetings. So apart from your take on how Turkey is viewing this conflict, How do you see your efforts are yielding results? To what extent can we hope for some kind of a durable peace? Ambassador Alper Coskun.
Thank you so much. Greetings to everyone. My deepest appreciation for the invitation. This is a really mind-opening debate. I've been in numerous events, as you can imagine, as all of you have, on this issue, and I've come to realize that most of the time, despite the fact that we live in a globalized world, we actually live in our own little bubbles, and this is a very useful exposure for me to see this event from different perspectives, and I appreciate this opportunity greatly. What I will try and do, as you mentioned, is to focus on Turkey, where it stands in this state of war between Russia and Ukraine. And I will talk about the nature of the Turkish-Russian relationship, because I think that is important, something that is often misunderstood, particularly by Turkey's Western allies and partners. I'll talk a little bit about the implications of Russia's war on Ukraine, again from Ankara's perspective, and make some small predictions and policy suggestions at the end. But before that, I want to, in reference to the opening questions that Mr. Pandya posed, and to some of the comments that my distinguished predecessors made, I just want to make a couple of general remarks. I think it's a very important question. Was this war avoidable? I guess the verdict is out, but in reality, in a conscionable manner, what we all have to agree is and concede is that it should have been avoidable. And at the end of the day, the fact that, as Andrey mentioned, that war has broken out is an utter failure of diplomacy, which should have prevailed. In practical terms, I think this is a grand failure of the international system. Ambassador Carmen referred to the irony of Russia chairing a UN Security Council meeting that is focusing on Russia's attack on Ukraine. But should we be surprised by that reality? Are we rediscovering the fact that the United Nations and the Security Council in particular is actually a political body, and that realpolitik prevailed at the time of the establishment of this structure, and that realpolitik continues to prevail? Is it the first time that we've seen the UN Security Council handicapped? No, we've seen it in Syria as well, much to Turkey's disappointment in the past, and in other examples that has affected each of our countries in one way or another. So this is truly a moment of truth for the international system that has failed. And then, of course, the Euro-Atlantic security architecture that was already in collapse, I think has met its demise in many ways. And you referenced, Mr. Pandya referenced George Kennan and John Mearsheimer and their comments, and then there were references to NATO enlargement expansion as a provocation. I think, Moscow was my first post. I was there between 92 and 95, right after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Was there enough empathy on the part of the West to the state of affairs in Russia at the time? Probably not. In fact, absolutely not. But framing what we are experiencing in Ukraine now from this prism alone is insufficient and misleading in many ways, because it does rest on the understanding that Russia was not granted enough empathy. True, that is, I think, something that needs to be debated in retrospect. But if we only focus on that, then we're missing another important element, which is the fact that other countries, think of the Baltics and think of the Eastern European nations, for one reason or another, chose a path that was to the detriment maybe of Russia's security interests. But at the end of the day, when we think of the principles that we all agreed upon in the Euro-Atlantic security architecture, from the Helsinki Final Act to the Paris Charter to the Istanbul documents, founding documents or very foundational documents for the OSCE and for Euro-Atlantic security architecture, we all agreed that every nation had a right to choose its path and its future. And Russia is a signatory to these. So coming to a very good point that was made by my previous speaker, Dr. Sarah, that we have to be reminded of the premise of why Russia started this war, and that is found in President Putin's statements, and that was very much focused on Ukraine's nationhood, its history, its right to exist. And I think we need to bear that in mind, as well as the fact that at the end of the day, this is an act of aggression that we all have to be reminded of. So I think that general framework is really important to remember. And looking into the future, Andrey depicted 3 different scenarios. I guess the real question is, are we heading towards a Hobbesian international security arena, or will prudence and sobriety prevail, despite the fact that realpolitik will always define international relations in one form or another? But will we be able to see individual nations furthering their interests on the premise of cooperative security again? We are very far from that perspective right now, and I think we're seeing a breakdown of the international system. After having made those general comments in response to some of the comments that have been made, let me talk now a little bit about Turkey's relationship with Russia, and then continue the flow as I mentioned. First of all, Turkey's relationship with Russia is a historical fact, and it has always been and will always continue to be a very important vector in Turkish foreign policy. As of late, particularly in the aftermath of the breakup of the Soviet Union, it has gained an additional economic, commercial, trade, and energy dimension. And this interlinkage between Russia and Turkey has been mutually beneficial in many respects. There is no doubt about that. And it's in the interest of both Russia and Turkey to maintain this cooperation as regional actors. And I think it's also in the interest of regional stability for Turkey and Russia, even though Turkey is a NATO member, even though, as I will explain, we find ourselves at opposite ends in many theaters and on many issues. Maintaining a manageable relationship between Turkey and Russia is critically important. And ironically, this is something that the Biden administration, when it first came to power, had formulated as its policy objective vis-a-vis Russia, conceding that there were challenges, conceding that there were a lot of disagreements between Moscow and Washington. The Biden administration's opening statement when it came into power was that it wanted a manageable, predictable relationship with Russia. This is, of course, before what happened in Ukraine. Now, Turkey's enhanced engagement, particularly under the current government in the past years, is seen from a rather restricted prism, particularly by Turkey's NATO allies and its Western partners. The focus, and understandably the case, the focus is more on things like the enhanced engagement between Turkey and Russia, the populist rhetoric that is often employed in domestic politics in Turkey, and the icing on the cake, something that India will be able to understand, was the acquisition, obviously, of the S-400 air and missile defense system, which raised doubts among our Western allies, among NATO members, about Turkey's orientation, about Turkey standing within NATO. So that very much blurred, if you will, the understanding of Turkey's engagement with Russia. Now, these are all facts, and these are important facts. They obviously mean something as far as Turkey's orientation is concerned, but there's no doubt, and that is a point that is often forgotten in the West, that there is more to the relationship between Turkey and Russia than meets the eye. It's not straightforward by any stretch of the word, and in reality, it's distinguished or defined more so by inconsistencies. And again, a reality of the MENA region. Seeming inconsistencies are a part of daily life. It is a reality that we are all used to in this part of the world, in our part of the world. The relationship between Turkey and Russia is maybe defined significantly by elements of rivalry rather than a normal functioning relationship. And historically, that's always been the case, which is why Turkey has traditionally tried to balance and offset Russia's influence and power in the region, which is why in today's environment, NATO membership and its alliance, Turkey's membership in the Western alliance ecosystem, is an invaluable asset for Ankara. Politicians in Turkey may, for one reason or another, be reluctant to make this point, but when push comes to shove, we do go to Brussels and we do confer with our NATO allies as to how we can act in a collective manner and thereby obviously boost Turkey's own security interests. The S-400 acquisition, just to open a small parenthesis, was never designed in Turkey as the first step towards orbiting away from NATO or from the Western alliance, not at all. And in fact, the reactions that Turkey has seen are doing exactly that, though that was not the intention on the part of Ankara, which again is a significant conundrum. The odd dynamic that I'm talking about in the nature of the Turkish-Russian relationship is visible in many theaters, ranging from Syria to Libya to the South Caucasus, where, as I briefly mentioned, Turkey and Russia are managing the circumstances in these theaters, but are absolutely at opposite ends in terms of the end game and the short-term objectives that they are pursuing. Yet, they've been able to manage this rivalry, and I think that's what made the difference in the past couple of years, both for Moscow and for Ankara. And this has come at a point in time where Turkey's relationship with its traditional allies, with the United States particularly, but also with its European allies, has significantly deteriorated for one reason or another. But ultimately, there are limits to the engagement that Turkey can have with Russia. Ankara knows that. It's actually very clear-eyed about the dynamics of this relationship, and I think the war in Ukraine has added to that understanding in Ankara's eyes. When it comes to the war in Ukraine, let me talk a little bit about Turkey's posture and explain what Turkey is trying to do as far as I can see. First of all, it's important to note that I think Turkey is probably a step beyond the framework in which we have all been discussing up until this point as far as its support for Ukraine is concerned. Because from day one, Turkey's called a spade. It called Russia's act a state of war. It has joined the UN General Assembly resolutions condemning Russia's action, including the recent vote on the Human Rights Commission. And it has, in a manner consistent with this position, declared that given this state of war, it will close the transit of the belligerent powers through the Turkish Straits based on the 1936 Montreux Convention, which Turkey finds itself as the custodian of. The second point I'd like to make about Turkey's posture vis-a-vis Ukraine is these steps on the part of Turkey by Turkey's very Western allies and partners were seen as a little bit of a surprise. They welcomed it, and they encouraged Turkey to continue in that direction, but that was a total misreading of realities in the sense that Turkey has had a very consistent position in terms of supporting Ukraine's territorial integrity, in terms of standing against Russia's acts that undermine the inviolability of Ukraine's borders, internationally recognized borders. Turkey, since 2014, has probably been one of the most vocal advocates for Ukraine's territorial integrity, as well as its Euro-Atlantic integration desire, and it has stood against the annexation of Crimea. So when you look at that pattern in Turkish foreign policy in this regard, the decision that came about after the war in Ukraine is only natural. And to me, it's a surprise that it came as a surprise to our Western allies and partners. And let's not forget that Turkey has likewise been very supportive of Georgia, has been selling arms, and has been engaging Ukraine in many different fields of cooperative engagement, but also including in defense industry for some time now. I was talking recently to the Ukrainian ambassador in Ankara, and he jokingly told me that boys that are born in Ukraine nowadays mostly will be named Bayraktar. That is the name of the Turkish drone that they have used efficiently there. And Nagöz will be named Javelina. He was joking, obviously. But this is just to highlight the nature of the engagement that Turkey has had with Ukraine and its position that has been consistent for some time now. Now, the third point is sanctions. And Turkey has not joined in sanctions. And I totally agree with the comments that have been made that there's a limit to how effective sanctions can be. In fact, in most cases, and Turkey has experienced this over and over again in its own region, it's detrimental and it never produces the results that are declared at the outset. Ironically, ever since the end of the Cold War, at one point in time or another, one of Turkey's neighbors, Iran, Iraq, Syria, now Russia, have been sanctioned in one way or another. For a country that thrives economically on cross-border trade, on regional engagement, for a country like Turkey that is driven by an export economy, these are significant handicapping results. And the fact, of course, that Turkey itself has been subjected to sanctions by its very allies, most notably the United States, both in the past, but also today because of its S-400 acquisition under the Katsa regime. Turkey has a very distant approach to these forms of extraterritorial sanctions and feels itself bound only by sanctions that are blessed by the United Nations Security Council. So as a matter of principle, Turkey does not sign up to these types of sanctions. Its economic interests and its energy reliance with Russia and a lot of other dynamics, obviously, also in practical terms, make it difficult for Turkey. But Turkey, nevertheless, mirrored its principled approach as far as the state of war in Ukraine is concerned by doing other things. It closed its airspace to Russian military flights. And as far as I know, it has also asked Russia not to conduct civilian flights to Syria. And this was particularly in response to news that had come out that maybe Russia may tap into foreign fighters from Syria. The fourth point, and that's what I think is on everyone's mind, is Turkey's efforts to facilitate the dialogue between Ukraine and Russia. And this is an area where we've seen Turkey trying to leverage its good standing both in Kiev and in Moscow. There were two important rounds of meetings. The first took place in Antalya, where the two foreign ministers from Ukraine and Russia were present. The symbolism was important. The content was limited and modest at the time. But then the round that took place in Istanbul at a more technical level, according to the words of both the Ukrainian and Russian delegations, was the most productive one that they had had up until that point in time. Turkey continues to provide its good offices in this regard. This is not necessarily an act of mediation. Turkey is not actively negotiating texts with the parties. It is providing the grounds and the atmosphere. It is facilitating. It is talking to both sides and trying to come up with ideas. And it has openly committed itself to any role that may be required of Turkey, including as a guarantor of a hopefully post-conflict settlement that both Ukraine and Russia would be able to agree upon. Obviously, it's in Turkey's immediate interests to end this state of war as soon as possible, and we see this in its facilitation efforts. Let me come to the implications of the war as far as Turkey is concerned, and I'll just make 4 points there. First is there's a psychological implication. There's a very visceral interest in Turkey looking towards the east, to the rise of China, to the potential of enhanced cooperation with that part of the world that has gained traction among a lot of thinkers and analysts in Turkey, that I think has been coupled or maybe fed by a very strong sense of disappointment with Turkey's traditional allies, notably, again, the United States, particularly ever since the fabricated invasion of Iraq in 2003, but more recently because of the United States' and some other allies of Turkey's choice to work with elements in Syria that are offshoots of the PKK terrorist organization that Turkey is fighting against, that comes at the expense of Turkey's security interests. And this is something that has permeated beyond party lines in Turkey, and that has really blurred the perception of the true friendship that should prevail between Turkey and its Western allies, and has fed into this visceral search for maybe a new path. And China and Russia were in that sense advocated by some circles. But I think the war in Ukraine has been a reality check, and while this Russophobia and this focus towards the East is still prevalent in certain circles, I think it's become less credible nowadays to argue for that type of a future. That said, there is across the board recognition of the fact that friendly, stable, cooperative relations with Russia and obviously with China as well are in Turkey's interests. The second thing I think is implication is that this has been a wake-up call in terms of energy reliance and Turkey's vulnerability to Russia in that respect, something that has led to a paradigm shift as far as we can see in places like Germany, though there are a lot of different aspects that one needs to consider. The third implication from Turkey's perspective, I think, is in relation to the S-400 and the potential enhancement of defense industry cooperation with Russia. I think it has become increasingly unrealistic for Turkey looking into the future, though political rhetoric will continue to make this point. I think in practical terms, that is unrealistic to expect. And the fourth point I would like to make is that it has made Turkey more inclined to search for solutions in the neighborhood with regional actors, including Israel, and we see Turkey recalibrating its approach to dealing with the challenges that it has had with regional actors. At times, at Turkey's behest, there has been a deterioration in these relations. At times, at the behest of regional actors, these relations have been burdened. But now we see an attempt on the part of Turkey to mend fences with a lot of regional actors, and certain headway has been made. And my predecessor also made this point. I think this is something that will continue in the region, and we will see Turkey reaching out to regional actors in a more active and sincere manner. Looking into the future, I think as far as Turkey's priorities are concerned, from a political, security, economic, and energy aspect, it's clear that Turkey has an interest in an immediate ceasefire and a return to normalcy in the region. Is this a realistic expectation? Given the way that the dynamics are evolving in the war and what seems to be an imminent large-scale attack on the eastern part of Ukraine, I think that unfortunately the short-term scenario is that things will probably get worse before they get better. But Turkey does not see an interest in this war going on and does not advocate seeing Russia bleed in a war of this nature. And increasingly weakened Russia is not in Turkey's interests. A brazen Russia is not in Turkey's interests either, but a Russia, Ukraine that are happy in their internationally recognized borders in a cooperative framework where the cooperative nature of relations in the neighborhood and beyond are not burdened by sanctions would be Turkey's desire. But I think that aspiration and its materialization will need some more time given the state of affairs. I'll leave it at that. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Ambassador Coskun. Thank you. So such a very profound take you took, a very comprehensive one on Turkish interests and policies, and hope that this war ends. Everybody wants it to end quickly, but as you said, that it might get worse before it gets better. But I hope we don't come to that, and good sense prevails, and your efforts continue to yield some fruit for the people of Ukraine and the others as well. Everybody is going to suffer because this war is having a global impact, and all the countries are suffering, especially the ones which are importing gas and who have the food security is a major concern for everyone. Now I would like to request the military perspective of the war and how it is going to play out. And of course, Dr. Sara also asked a question for the future wars, which no one better than General Sayyid Ata Hasnain, who's one of the most decorated generals India had, is here with us. And he was also the military secretary of the Indian Army. Prior to that, he commanded the Indian Army's 15th Corps in the state of Jammu and Kashmir. So he knows how to handle the situation. He has also commanded 21 Corps Strike. General Hasnain is the Chancellor of the Central University of Kashmir. General Hasnain, floor is yours. But the time is 10 minutes, so that is something, that's the challenge.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador Trigunayat, and thank you very much, Abhinav. Everything which had to be said has already been said. I think 10 minutes is not a problem at all. It's been a learning experience, absolutely, listening to the fascinating narratives by all our very eminent panelists here. I will take just 10 minutes, maybe less, to give you a military perspective, but there are certain political-diplomatic aspects which I'd like to allude to too. And it starts with the first question which Abhinav had asked, that was this war avoidable? And my immediate conclusion and deduction is it was not avoidable. The war had to be fought. There's a reason for it, and let me try and rationalize that. Let's go back to 1919, the Treaty of Versailles. You learned nothing from World War I. 4 years of the war within 20 years, led to World War II, because no one understood the management of victory and the management of defeat. 50 years later, in 1990, once again, when the Cold War ended, no one had learned the lessons of 1919, and no one understood the management of victory and the management of defeat. Although there was nothing so stark as a victory and a defeat in 1990, but obviously the Soviet Union had broken up. The US and NATO had won. But the push started, and it was actually a one-way push. It pushed Russia so that there would never be a revival of Russia, there would never be a revival of the former Soviet Union, perhaps, and that push continued for the next 24 years. That's up to 2014. The inclusion of nations into NATO, and things of that nature, it continued. Russia's genuine concerns perhaps were not catered for. There were red lines which Russia had, and Ukraine was one of them. Perhaps even the Baltic states, the Baltic republics, were a red line at one stage, but Russia could live with that. Ukraine is something Russia could not live with. An inroad into the innards of Russia. And the most important aspect, the Black Sea. Geostrategically, Russia just could not hand over the advantage of having access to warm waters somewhere. It had no access to warm waters. It had access to the Arctic Circle in the north, and it had access to the Pacific Ocean as far away as Vladivostok and the Far East. The only place where it could access the Mediterranean was here in the Black Sea. Why did Russia go to Syria in 2015? What was the prime reason why it went to the support of Syria in 2015? This is something of interest to Ambassador Anil also. Primarily, to my mind, the way I concluded it, primarily to ensure that the port of Latakia continued to remain with it, because there was no other port that it had in the Mediterranean, and that is a port it could not afford to lose. Its access, its ability to have some influence in the Western Mediterranean was so important. And it responded with not all-out war. It responded with a hybrid war, right? It went into Crimea, it went into Donbass, increased influence there. It sent home the message clearly that this is my red line. Came the year 2021, and it was clear post-pandemic Now, this is the time when Russia started over-assessing itself and over-assessing its capability. That's the time when they realized perhaps that this was an opportune moment to try and make sure that NATO's ambition of getting into Ukraine was contained on the western side of Ukraine, on the western borders of Ukraine. Russia probably considered that this was the opportune moment in 2021-22 for a couple of reasons. Number one was Afghanistan. NATO had just withdrawn from Afghanistan, virtually defeated. There were new leaderships everywhere. There was a new leadership in Germany. There was a new leadership in the United States. Not too confident a leadership in the UK either. And therefore, NATO was not considered strong enough at this time. Perhaps the response would not come. So, to my assessment, this is the time when Russia thought is the ideal time to send home that message clearly, calibrate a little beyond 2014, calibrate a little beyond the hybrid war. And that's what it did. It overestimated. Overconfidence, hubris. This is what led him to imagine that they could win this war in 3 days to 5 days. This is unimaginable how they could underassess the capability of Ukraine. Wasn't the intelligence available to them to think that since 2014, the Ukrainian army was being trained by the United States, was being trained by NATO. There were weapons which were flowing in there. None of that happened. And they all felt it was just going to be a walkover. The Russians hadn't fought a conventional war well for long. We used to respect the Russian army tremendously during the Cold War, the doctrine of the operational maneuver group and things like that. The only wars Russia fought were Chechnya or bits in Dagestan, Georgia. Yes, successfully in Georgia, but not the classic conventional conflict. They fought a very successful hybrid conflict in Ukraine from 2014 onwards, and that perhaps added to the hubris. So now the military situation, when you get into fight an enemy you don't know, the very famous Sun Tzu principle. If you don't know your enemy, then how are you going to fight him? The Russians didn't know Ukraine well enough, perhaps. They went in without air power. They went in with calibration. When things started going wrong, they went berserk on the humanitarian front completely, in the sense that blasted buildings, went into cities and things like that. From a military perspective, in 2 or 3 minutes, let me tell you, the Russian intention was regime change. The Russian intention was the capture of a few major cities like Kharkiv, Kyiv itself, Mariupol, etc. It was also to diminish the capability of the Ukrainian armed forces, and it was to enhance its influence in the Donbass. This was to my mind, this is the 4 objectives that it had for itself. It has not achieved any of them, and it's not perhaps capable of achieving any of them. There's a simple reason for it. You can keep blasting cities till the cows come home, but unless you're prepared to send in your infantry into those cities to capture them, those cities will not be yours. This is exactly what's happened to Kyiv. You've sent in special forces into the Kyiv airport and never sent in a link up after that. You sent in armored columns. You're hearing of this very famous 64-kilometer long armored column which has been sitting north of Kyiv for the last 40 days. It has not gone beyond that. You don't have logistics for it, right? And you don't have the capability to send in the infantry. Very simple reason. Russia is one of those nations which from 145 million population is going to reduce to 135 million in the next few years, right? They don't have young people. You need young people to manage the infantry, to go in and capture and be killed. More body bags go home to Russia is going to create problems for them, for the leadership. So militarily, these cities are not going to be theirs. Not easily. There's going to be a much greater loss before they can gain anything. As far as regime change is concerned, now that they have withdrawn from Kyiv, that is not possible at all. Compromising the Ukrainian armed forces, I think actually they're enhancing the capability of the Ukrainian armed forces. Their military aim of compromising and diluting the capability of the Ukrainian armed forces, actually they have enhanced it. The entire western portion, if you see from Kyiv up to the Polish-Hungarian border, has been left free. That's the direction from which all the weaponry is coming in. The Javelin missiles, all the other things, all the anti-tank missiles which are coming in, the Stingers which are coming in, everything is coming in from there. Spreading yourself thin all over without the intent of going in strongly to capture certain areas is actually costing Russia this war. So I think the Russian strategy is completely flawed. Having said this, I would also say that it would not be correct on the part of NATO to think that they can rub Russia's nose into the ground and win this war. This war is unwinnable. Very correctly said by some of our speakers that there's going to be no victory. There's no victor and there's no vanquished here. Everyone has lost this war. If NATO does not realize this, they will be making the same mistake they made in 1919. But at the Treaty of Versailles, what the Western powers had made at that time. They must start scaling down, and they must give Russia a window. They must give Putin a capability, an opportunity to start seeing how this war can be wound down. At the moment, that is not appearing anywhere. Diplomacy in this kind of thing, military diplomacy in this, all caters for creation of those windows of opportunity. For someone who's losing the war, you don't want him to get emaciated completely, because the emaciation of Russia is going to have a terrible effect everywhere. Imagine what will happen to Central Asia, for example. A weakened Russia, and see what happens to the new great game areas in Central Asia, all waiting for the upsurge of Islamism in those particular areas. All this will start spreading into the Middle East in the same way. The gravitation of foreign fighters into Ukraine from different directions. These are the fighters who will ultimately spread into Europe. Exactly what happened post-Afghanistan in 1989, 1990. We felt it in Kashmir. We felt it in Chechnya. We felt it in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So this window has to be given its most important calibration of the sanctions, getting Russia out of China's grip, China's trap. That is one of the most essential aspects of future diplomacy. In fact, current diplomacy to future diplomacy. Don't push countries like India to start cutting themselves off from Russia. It's going to be counterproductive, and what you will end up losing both. So that is also the wrong kind of a strategy. Open up humanitarian channels. There are no humanitarian channels at the moment in Ukraine. This has to open up. Manage the information war. You are no doubt today the information is all flowing only from NATO channels, nothing from Russia. Whatever I'm writing is based upon the source information I get from NATO channels. This information war has to be calibrated, because the more you push Russia, the greater will be the pushback from there. Putin has to be given a face saver. Russia has to be given a face saver. If you want this war not to extend, otherwise this can be a long war. It can carry on and on to for destruction of Eastern Europe and much of what we've been talking among all the panelists. But that face saver has to be given. What is that face saver? What is the face saver which Putin is looking for? And that's one of my last points. Putin is essentially, or Russia is essentially looking at face saving, a calibration, a downscaling of the political-military objectives that it laid out for itself in the beginning. It can't capture cities. Well, it's going to attempt to do that in Donbass. That's going to create hell, as we very correctly said, make it worse before it starts getting better. But before it starts getting worse itself, let's try and make it better for Russia. The second thing is, maybe Russia would be happy to rest itself on the Dnieper, on the river Dnieper. Perhaps that is one of the things that one can look at. Back channels have to be opened for this kind of a thing. There's not very much else that you can really give them in terms of face savers, except perhaps the capture of one or two cities. Let the Russians go back, not militarily disgraced. That is actually the management of victory in a classic sense. I can carry on the military front with a number of other issues, but I think I've run out of my time completely. These are just thoughts which are there at the moment. I hope I have not taken a stance which is weighed in the favor of either side, because I continue to remain absolutely neutral, just the way my country remains neutral. Thank you very much.
Thank you, General Hasnain. That's absolutely fabulous. And, a face saving is a must, irrespective of whatever the other countries do. But for the time being, we are not looking. It doesn't seem like there is a window of that sort, but it'll come, I guess, because there is no other way. And I'm not sure what transpired between Prime Minister Modi and President Biden, but precisely that's what India has conveyed in the bilaterals. Now we have come to the last but not the least, and I had promised Dr. John Harrison I'm so sorry that to keep you for so long waiting, but Professor, he's the professor at the Rabdan University in Abu Dhabi, a senior analyst for Cyberpoint International. He was also a professor for the National Defense University Program for the U.S. Special Operations Community at Fort Bragg. Previously, he was the head of terrorism research at the International Center for Political Violence and Terrorism in Singapore and served as the coordinator of transportation security at the university's Center for Excellence in National Security. Professor Harrison, the biggest job is, what is US thinking now, in your view?
Well, thank you, first of all, on behalf of Rabdan Academy. Thank you for including me and us in this very interesting presentation. Technically, my PhD is actually in international relations, so I really enjoy occasionally being challenged beyond being just the humble terrorism guy that I like to present myself as. And the last speaker always has the sets one easy task, because I can fall back and say, well, all of the distinguished speakers before me said everything I was going to say. So let's get to the Q&A. But I think that's probably a little bit of a cheat on my part. So what I'd like to do is try to see if we can summarize everything that was said, and then I'll also work in some of my own thoughts on this. The first question that we started the evening with was essentially, was the war avoidable? And I would agree with the panels that yes, it was avoidable. Russia made the decision to invade. Whatever the political manifestations behind it, whatever the security issues were, can't really justify the invasion of another country. We've talked quite a bit about lessons learned, and I think one of the things that the Russians themselves may have learned the wrong lesson. The U.S. has some experience in successfully removing a regime. The invasions of countries have gone pretty well for the U.S. military. It's the occupation that has been rather problematic. Here, the Russians seem to have been unable to successfully get the first part, so that they won't actually face probably an insurgency of any length, because they may not be around very long. I would also agree that, by and large, we say this in counterinsurgency, that both sides are looking for sort of a strategic equilibrium, understanding that militarily there is no victory possible at this point. So then you look for the political settlement, which all war is ultimately about politics, as Clausewitz famously said. And we're not there yet. Certainly, if we had had this presentation a week ago, you probably would have said that there's very little chance that the Ukrainians will militarily be able to succeed on really any level. But now, I think that's a debatable point. They may be able to push the Russians out of, and they have in some areas already. Whether or not that leads them to conclude that there is no diplomatic settlement because they can militarily win, that's not clear yet. And I still think ultimately, if the Russians put their mind to it, that they have the resources to be able to defeat the Ukrainians, even with NATO and other support. Warfare has changed, as the international system has as well, and I'll come to that in a moment. There has been a great deal of discussion in some military circles already that the whole idea of hybrid warfare has now been completely eviscerated, and we're back to old style conventional conflict. That is true. But I don't think we should disregard the idea of hybrid warfare, or whatever the term of the week happens to be, to describe this mix of conventional, unconventional, and a variety of other types of warfare. That will remain a part of the international system. It has been successful, and it continues to be successful. And many powers will try to use this in various ways because they are learning a lesson that war is expensive. We should have known this, but particularly conventional war. the international community has not seen one of these for quite some time. And the lessons that one learns from fighting insurgencies and guerrilla groups and terrorists and whatever term you'd like to use aren't often transferable to a broader geostrategic conflict. And I think that's perhaps what we're relearning here. The other thing that the international system is, I don't know if it's learning, but it's certainly seeing in a very stark way, as we heard from our first presenter today, that the international system is under stress. It has been for a number of decades. COVID highlighted some of the underlying stresses, and the war has done the same thing. The UN, for various reasons, is not capable of dealing with an issue like this. It is not a glitch in the system. It is a design factor within the system. Whether or not that means that the current system has to be totally revolutionarily changed or just reformed is another issue. Reforming the system doesn't change the underlying fact. It doesn't change the underlying facts that we have a system that is designed and led by nation states. Nation states have interests, and as we're seeing, different groups will have different interests and will express those in different ways. Certainly, Europe and North America have said very definitively that Russia is the cause of the war and that there are going to be consequences. The rest of the world has not necessarily followed along. There are a number of nations, certainly India and the nation that I happen to be in now, the UAE, that have some ability to be able to maneuver within the new system. But at some point, there may have to be a decision taken. And I would agree with several of the speakers saying, don't push India, don't push the UAE, don't push other countries, but that may come. And it will be interesting to see how that plays out. The international system is also playing out in multipolarization, however you want to define this. But we've been seeing this for some time, certainly here in the MENA region. We've had the rise of a number of powers. The UAE has been called Little Sparta. The UAE and the Saudis have taken interest into their own hands. Certainly the United States at various times has said to allies, both in this region and in NATO, you have to take more responsibility for your own security. Whether or not that means the US is withdrawing from the international system is another issue. And certainly perceptions become reality. Whether or not the US is withdrawing, many nations, allies and opponents alike, seem to think that it is. And that vacuum is going to be filled by someone or a series of someones, as again, we're seeing here in this region. The conflict has also will have, I think, a very big impact on an issue that was seen as central to American foreign policy is now secondary, JCPOA and Iran. I would totally agree with one of our early speakers that this is going to be a fundamental problem for the United States and many of the United States allies and partners in the region. Iran has, even under extreme sanctions, been able to support financially in other ways actors that it considers important to its foreign and security policy. When the sanctions are lifted, and they will be, the United States and much of the international community needs to figure out how to offset the potential loss of Russian oil. Iran will be able to make up a portion of that. When Iran does that, and when sanctions are lifted, the resources that Iran will have available will certainly be used to help its foreign policy. There is very little effort that Iran has in supporting domestically. This is about foreign security. And Iran, with more resources to be able to supply and fund actors in Yemen and Lebanon and Syria and other places, will be able to have a profound effect. And this will challenge the US in a very fundamental way. Will it be there for its allies? And if it's not, what will its allies do? We've already seen this, the Saudis have decided to publicly talk about and hint that they may start pricing oil in yuan or renminbi. If that happens, it will be a fundamental change to the international system. It will challenge the system probably in ways that we haven't seen since the 1970s, when the world went off the gold standard. And while it will eventually work itself out, there will be several years of profound economic dislocation, inflation, additional interruptions to the supply chain. And if that continues, we'll see not only problems that we've seen in places like Egypt, but we may see far more problems like we've been seeing in Sri Lanka, where a country that traditionally has not been seen as one that will be challenged by many international problems is now under enormous stress. And however that plays out there, it can have profound impacts around the rest of not only South Asia, but in many other countries around the world. So I think this bears watching. In addition, we have seen the change of the relationship with China. China is certainly watching this very carefully. It has put an enormous amount of effort in cultivating Russia. Russia and China have different interests. That is true. That is clear. Central Asia is one of those places of potential conflict. And I would agree with the general that we shouldn't push Russia into the hands of China, but they're already moving that direction anyway. And what that means is going to be unclear. And how the international community plays this out will be very interesting to watch and very dangerous to watch, as again, the international community does not like a vacuum, and somebody will fill that, whether it's through the existing structures or whether it's through new and evolved structures. It's not clear. But the best way that we have in the international community have figured out how to manage the last 70 years is through a very imperfect system, but one that at very least offers the opportunities to prevent conflict from becoming larger. And we may be seeing that unfold now. The final question that we kind of started with this evening was, well, what are the ways out of the conflict? And at the moment, it's not clear. We are 48 days into a conflict that many people, as many of our analysts this evening have pointed out, would have said should have been over in 3, maybe 4 days. Okay? The fact that a leader, Zelensky, has had no reason to anybody to believe that he was going to be able to rise to the occasion. And certainly Russia thinking that the timing of the invasion, I would completely agree that the change in leadership in Germany, the change in leadership in the United States, Brexit, all of these things have led Russia to figure that the international community won't stop them. And the lessons that they learned from 2014 was that Ukraine itself won't be able to stop an invasion. And when you have a leader who was universally described as a comedian who somehow got elected to office, you don't have really any sense that they're going to be able to meet the challenges that they did. He has. And it has been an amazing scene. And certainly if Ukraine is able to declare victory, whatever that means, and certainly it's more likely at this point to mean that there will not be a Sudetenland solution where Crimea and parts of Ukraine will remain under Russian occupation. But however that ends, Zelensky will have a tremendous amount of political capital to be able to spend on issues that will relate to Ukraine and how Ukraine sees itself in the international community and how it sees its state and its role in that will be quite fascinating to watch, not only within the region, but obviously the wider world. The final point that I would make as part of this conflict is that there's an interesting issue where the Ukrainian nation has rallied its entire population, and that's a good thing. This will give the resiliency of the country some ability to survive not only this challenge, but the redevelopment that happens after this war has ended. But it's also created an interesting problem for the international community. Not only has the entire population been mobilized, but we do have foreign fighters coming in again, but this time they are part of, or perhaps part of, a military, a national army. What does that mean? How do we understand how this conflict will play out? We already have challenges and are not sure what does cyber warfare mean and what do cyber attacks. And both sides, you're right, are doing this. And both sides, it's very unclear where the red lines are. But if we have civilianized conflicts, and if we have dramatically increased the number of combatants, as long as they're fitting in with the international system, that's fine. But it's not clear that they are. And it's not clear how we look at combatants who are joining militaries. Are they going to be under the military control? What does this mean? All of this will be playing out over the next, I would say, not only just days, but probably years to come. And from a terrorism perspective, this creates challenges. From a security at large perspective, this creates challenges. And the international community doesn't at the moment seem to be able to quite figure out how to deal with the existing challenges that it faces, not only on the security side, but on the supply chain, the economic side, and with COVID. Certainly, I'm somebody who's glad we're not talking about COVID for at least a little while anymore, but we may have a big outbreak again in China. All of this puts an enormous amount of stress on the international community, one that we certainly have not seen since the Second World War. And I think that bears watching, and we will certainly be I'm sure, having many more conversations on this and various aspects of this during the months and years to come. So again, I thank all of you for the opportunity to not only speak tonight, but also to listen and to just be thoroughly engaged and impressed by just the range of issues that obviously are not being picked up many times in the general public discussion on this. And it will be one that I hope we'll all be able to take back to improve and deepen the analysis on this very challenging conflict. So I look forward to any discussion that we're going to have after this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Harrison. It was absolutely fabulous that you brought out and virtually summarized what is likely to happen. And we have already overshot our time by some minutes, but I would like to request Mr. Abhinav Pandya, CEO of the Usanas Foundation, to take it forward. The only job remains for me is to really thank you, each one of you, for that profound presentations that you made. Hope they will contribute to some kind of a peacemaking eventually, and a better understanding of the conflict and how it's likely to end. Abhinav, please take over.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Trigunayat, for chairing this session and for staying with us for this long. I can understand it was a very long session, but then we came across very beautiful and profound insights on this critical issue. So we have already exceeded the time.
We've lost you. The audio has failed.
I said that we have already exceeded the time that we scheduled for this today's event. So we cannot take all the questions, but we can take one question. And the questions are mentioned in the chat box, and I leave it to all our experts if you want to take any one particular question from that. Please feel free. Can you see the questions in the chat box? If you would like to take the question, please feel free. We can take one question. No, my apologies for just cutting short the Q&A session.
No. Oh, there it is.
Yes, Dr. Harrison, I think that. And
oh no, that was a mistake. I'm
okay.
not seeing anything in the chat box, and it's probably just
Ambassador.
me, so
I guess Ambassador Coskun has some questions addressed to him, and please, Ambassador Coskun, yes.
Two questions directed in relation to Turkey.
Yes.
One is about
Yes.
the fact that Turkey is selling armed drones to Ukraine. I'm not aware of a continuing shipment of armed drones since the conflagration of the war, but Turkey, prior to the state of war between Ukraine and Russia, had signed numerous agreements with Ukraine that involved enhanced defense industry cooperation, including the joint production of drones, prior to which it had sold, according to open sources, 24 of these drones. But the fact that Turkey has this type of a defense industry cooperation with Ukraine is in no way an inhibitor of its ability to retain a strong standing with Russia and with Ukraine. In many instances, there are examples that Turkey can cite where Russia or even its allies are selling or providing weapons to areas that are a challenge to Turkey. So I don't see that necessarily as a predicament in that regard. It's a fact of life. And then there's another question about the settlement and whether Turkey would be able to shoulder the commitment of this idea of providing guarantees for Ukraine. The idea there and the details have to be worked on as far as I understand. It's just a rough understanding of what Ukraine is looking for in the absence of NATO membership. And if Ukraine were to agree to neutrality after a ceasefire, obviously, I think what Ukraine is talking about is that it would require some sort of a guarantee from P5 countries, involving obviously Russia as well, and it will be interesting to see how they plan on articulating that. But beyond that, they cite countries like Turkey, Israel, and some others like Germany, I think, to be part of this guarantors agreement, short of NATO membership, but akin to Article 5. So it would not be something that Turkey would be shouldering individually, and it would be, I think, as I said, the details are yet to be worked on, but something that up until this point, Turkey has expressed its readiness to discuss in good faith to see if it could contribute to the debate.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Coskun. And with this, we come to at the end of our today's session. And I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to all our eminent panelists today, Ambassador Daniel Cramon, Dr. Andrey Kortunov, Ambassador Vishnu Prakash, Dr. Masha Fainberg, Ambassador Coskun, and General Atta Hasnain, and Professor Dr. John Harrison. And also my special thanks to Ambassador Anil Trigunayat, who chaired the session. And this was indeed a very profound, insightful session and a comprehensive discourse on a very critical issue that we all are looking for a solution to this ongoing war today. And finally, what I can say is that to my questions, my first question was the war avoidable? I can see that there is a broad consensus. Yes, it was, but still the jury stands divided. And there are differences even in the consensus. I mean, even if the people are agreeing that war was avoidable, there are differences in the reasons why it was avoidable. For my second question, the quest for the global stability regime, also there appears to be some semblance of an answer that yes, we do need a global stability regime. And the current multilateral institutions like UN, they are weak, they have failed to deliver, but we don't have an option. And my third question, a roadmap to finding peace, that still remains more or less unanswered. People try to answer, the eminent panelists, try to find answers, but I guess, we're not able to find something concrete, though beautiful suggestions came from different panelists. And then finally, I can say that there are nations have interests. Based on that, they have friends. And finally, they have a stand. All I can say is that we are dealing with a very complex situation, and all our reactions so far have been nuanced and highly guarded. But perhaps we are missing a bigger picture. Are we heading for some much larger geopolitical tectonic shift that is going to unfold in the next 7 to 8 years? Indeed, we are. Maybe with the upcoming alliances like Russia, China, and Iran, we are headed for difficult times. Tomorrow, if Iran, with its religious regime, maddened by the nuclear power and belief in apocalyptic prophecies, decides to embark upon some misadventure in the Middle East, and China, driven by its Middle Kingdom dreams, decides to embark upon something in the South China Sea, then what are we going to do? Certainly, it will be a very different world. I guess we should picture that scenario in the mind, and we should make sure that we don't impose an embarrassing withdrawal on Russia. If we do that, we may be risking the replay of what happened after the Treaty of Versailles in 1990. In this tough time and a very critical scenario, the role played by independent and neutral nations like India and Israel becomes very critical. And I must say that over the last few years, especially under the leadership of PM Modi and Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, this friendship has grown by leaps and bounds. And in the future, these two countries can play a very critical role in bringing back sanity by talking to the different warring parties. And I guess our approach has to be to find a solution and not impose any unilateral, one-sided punishment regime. This goes in the humanity, and let's give diplomacy a chance for the sake of humanity, for friends, and for the good old times. With that, I would like to end today's session. Thank you very much, for coming today, for joining us today, and for sharing your thoughts in this highly insightful, profound, and a deep discourse on a very critical issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye, all.
Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you.